Subpart 234, Title 49 CFR Chapter 2, Subpart F. Highway, rail, pathway, cross inventory reporting. Definitions. Is used in this subpart class 1 as means assigned by the Regulations Surface Transportation Board, Title 49 CFR Part 1201, General Instructions 101, as part of the regulations that have to be revised and applied with the order of the included modification for the class hold threshold man with the revenue deflector adjustment. Closed crossing means the location where the previous crossing no longer exists because either the railroad tracks have been physically removed or each of the pathway, the roadway approach to the crossing have been physically removed, leaving the road behind no intersection with the railroad track, whether either the pathway or roadway are graded separated with the highway with the pathway crossing has been physically removed, also considered the closed crossing. Crossing inventory means for the U.S. National Highway Railway Crossing Inventory. The FRA Associated Administrator means the FRA Associated Administrator for the Railroad Safety Chief of the Safety Officer. Highway Rail Crossing means for the location where one or more of the railroad track will intersect with a public highway, road, street, private road, either at grade or grade separated, included as associated sidewalk. Inventory form means the U.S. Crossing Inventory Form, FRA Form 61871. Inventory Guide means the FRA Guide for the preparing highway rail crossing inventory form is in effect at the time of the submission of the data with the crossing inventory. Inventory means the number of the sign of the highway crossing, rail crossing, or pathway crossing with the crossing inventory. Operating railroad means the railroad, urban railroad transit operation that operates one or more transit trains through a highway rail pathway consisting of the line connected with the general railroad system of the transportation. Pathway crossing means a pathway that is explicitly authorized for the public authority of or a railroad dedicated for the use of the non-vehicular traffic, including pedestrians, bicyclists, or others, is not associated with the public highway, road, street, or other private roadway, and crosses one or more railroad tracks, either the grade or grade separated. Primary operating railroad means the operating of the railroad either owns and maintains the track through the highway, railway, path crossing, unless the crossing is located within a private company, port, or dock area. If more than one operating railroad either then owns and maintains the track through the highway rails pathway crossing, and if not operating the railroad owned to maintain the track through the highway rail pathway crossing, then operating the railroad that operates the highest number of the train through the crossing of the primary operating railroad. In the event that there is only one operating railroad that operates one or more trains through the highway rail pathway crossing, the operator railroad is primarily operating the railroad. If the highway rail pathway crossing is located with the primary private company port or dock area, each railroad has its own track leading to the private company port or dock area, with considered primary operating the railroad to supply with the crossing with the private company port or dock area. Private crossing means a highway rail or pathway crossing and is not in public crossing. A public crossing means a highway, railway, or pathway crossing which, whether it's appropriate under the jurisdiction maintained with the public authority, open with the public traffic. All approaches must be made under the jurisdiction with the public authority. No approach may be on the private property unless the state law or regulation provides otherwise. Temporary crossing means a highway or other pathway crossing created to serve a specific activity, temporary time period not exceeding 6 months. 234-403 submission of the data for the crossing inventory generally. Highway, railway, pathway crossing should be submitted to the crossing inventory on an inventory form except as provided in paragraph C of the section. Inventory form may be submitted with a hard copy electronic. The inventory form is electronic equivalent shall be complete with accordance with the inventory guide. The copy of the guide is obtained by the Office of Railroad Safety of the RS 23 of the Federal Railroad Administration, 1200 New Jersey Avenue, Southeast Washington, D.C. 20590. With a copy of the guide can also be reviewed or downloaded with the FRA Safety Data website under Forms Publication tab. Each of the railroad shall be submitted with the data required with the paragraph A of the section crossing inventory electronically. Reporting state agency of the behalf of the operating railroad. The state agency may submit with the crossing of the data for the crossing inventory. Behalf of the operating railroad, the state agency operating railroad shall provide with a written note to the FRA Associated Administrator with the state agency agree with the submitted update crossing of the data for all operating railroads, highways, and path crossings within the state. Reporting the parent corporation with on behalf of the subsidiary railroads, and in order to satisfy the reporting of the requirements of the section, the parent corporation may submit with the crossing data for the crossing inventory on the behalf of the one or more subsidiary railroads. Parent corporation and subsidiary railroads should provide with the written notice of the FRA Associated Administrator. The parent corporation has the resumed reporting, updating the responsibility for all of the subsidiary rails, highway, railway, and pathway crossing with the written notification shall include the following: a list of the subsidiary operation railroads in which the parent corporation will assume the reporting, updating of the responsibility, and explanation as to how the parent corporation and the subsidiary operating railroads operate as a single integrated with the United States railroad system. A statement signed by the Chief Executive Officer of the parent corporation, which the Chief Executive Officer shall consider for the behalf of the parent corporation, guarantee any of the monetary penalty, assessments, and other liabilities owned by the United States government that are incurred by the named subsidiaries of violation, reporting and updating the requirements set forth in subpart. 2. The parent corporation shall provide immediate written notification of the FRA Associated Administrator of the chain with the list of subsidiary operating railroads for which it has been assumed the reporting and updating the responsibility. The parent corporation shall submit the data required in paragraph A of this section with the crossing inventory electronically. Statute 234-405, submission of the initial data crossing inventory with the previously unreported crossings. Duty for the primary operating railroad 1-1 with the exemption of the highway with the pathway crossing located with the railroad yard passenger station within the private company with the port of dock area with each of the primary operating railroads shall assign with the inventory number to each of the previously unreported highway rail pathway crossing through which it operates. The primary operating railroad shall assign one or more of the inventory number of the previous unreported highway rail cross or pathway crossing through which it operates located with the railroad yard passenger station within the private company with the port of dock. 3. An inventory number shall not be assigned with a temporary crossing with a show inventory form with the submitted with the crossing inventory for the temporary crossing. With the exemption of the highway rail pathway crossing that are located with the private company and port or dock area, the primary operating railroad shall provide with the assigned inventory number to each of the operating railroad that operates one or more of the train through the previously thorough unreported highway pathway crossings of no later than January 6, 2016. Each primary operating railroad shall submit with the accurate, complete with the inventory form with the electronic equivalent cost of inventory and for the previously unreported highway pathway crossing through the which it operates no later than March 7, 2016. The inventory to or its electronic equivalent shall number reference with the assigned inventory number for the crossing and shall complete with the submitted in accordance with the statute 234-403. 2. The operating railroads that operate with separate track for the previously unreported highway railway path crossings of the operating railroads that operate without a separate track through the crossing with each of the operating railroads other than the primary operating railroad submit with the accurate crossing data with the such specified inventory guide with the crossing inventory no later than March 7, 2016. The inventory form of the electronic equivalent with the contained with the crossing data with the reference for the inventory 9 the sign with the crossing number that operating with the railroad and shall be complete with the submitted in accordance with the statute 234-403. Alright, due to all operating railroads, unless otherwise written certification statement that has provided with the primary operating railroad in accordance with the paragraph D of the section each of the operating railroads other than the primary operating railroad operates thoroughly with the previously unreported highway railway pathway crossing except with the temporary crossing for which the completed inventory form of the electronic equivalent has not been submitted with the crossing inventory in accordance with the paragraph A of the section shall notify the FRA Associated Administrator in writing with the oversight with notification and provide with the operating railroad shall include at a minimum the latitude and longitudinal coordinates to each of the previously unreported highway rail pathway crossing for completed inventory form and the electronic equivalent has not been submitted with the crossing inventory in accordance with the paragraph A of the section A is incomplete with the submission with the state agency for the data 1-1 if the primary operating railroad consists requires the state maintain with the crossing data with the appropriate state agency responsible for maintaining the highway the pathway crossing does not receive the requested data within 60 days of the primary operating railroad may provide with a written statement with the FRA Associated Administrator with the certifying that is requested the crossing data of the appropriate state agency responsible for maintaining highway railway pathway crossing data with at least 60 days prior to not receive the data of the written statement that prescribed with the FRA Associated Administrator pursuant to this section with the certified mail with the receipt with the request of the primary operating railroad will not be liable for the failure to timely submit with the accurate complete inventory term the other equivalent electronic equivalent is required in statute 234-405 A3. If the primary operating railroad received the request of crossing data with subsequent to the mailing of the certified statement under the section, the primary operating railroad shall submit the crossing data with the crossing inventory within 60 days of the receipt. 2. At the written statement provided with the pursuant subsection with the certified with the primary operating railroad with the request of the crossing inventory, one or more data fields have been assigned with the inventory data guide to the state with the updating the process of the requested information has not been provided with the written certification statement shall be maintained at no later than March 7, 2016. Copies of the written notification certification shall also be mailed to each operating rail with the operates thoroughly crossing state agency responsible for maintaining highway and pathway crossing data. 2. The written certification statement shall include the following: a list of each of the data that has been crossing information has been requested for the appropriate state and agency, the date of which the crossing information requested for the appropriate state agency. Statute 234-407. Submission of the initial data of the crossing inventory and new cross. The duty of the primary operating 101 exemption of the highway pathway crossing are located with the railroad yard passenger station within the private company, the port dock area with each of the primary operating railroads shall assign inventory number to each of the new highway rail pathway crossing through which it operates. To the primary operating railroad will assign one or more inventory number to the highway rail pathway crossing through which it operates, with it located with the railroad passenger station within the private company or port dock area. 3. An inventory number shall not be assigned with a temporary crossing with a shell, nor shall inventory form be submitted with the crossing inventory with a temporary crossing. 2. With the exemption of the highway rail pathway crossings and located with the private company with the port dock area with the primary operating railroad should provide with the assigned with the inventory number to each of the operating railroad that operates one or more of the train through the highway rail pathway crossing is no later than 4 months after the crossing becomes operational on January 6, 2016, with the which occurs in later, whichever occurs later. Alright, each primary operating railroad shall submit with the accurate, complete with the inventory form with the electronic equivalent crossing inventory with the new highway railway pathway crossing for which it operates no later than 6 months after the crossing becomes operational with March 7, 2016, which occurred later with the inventory form with the equivalent shall reference the sign with the inventory number of the crossing with it shall be complete with the submit with the accordance with the SG 234403. Due to the operating railroad when the operating railroads operate with a separate track with each of the new highway rail when the pathway crossings where the operating railroad operates trains in separate track through the crossing of each of the operating railroads shall submit with the accurate crossing the data with the specified with the inventory guide with the crossing inventory no later than March 7, 2016. Inventory form electronic equivalent with contains the crossing data shall reference the inventory number assigned with the crossing of the primary operating railroad that shall complete with the substantive the accordance with the statute 234-403. Duty of all operating railroads, unless the written certification statement has provided with the primary operating of the railroad in accordance with the paragraph D of the section of the operating of the railroad, but other than primary operating railroad that operated thoroughly the new highway railway pathway crossing except for the temporary crossing for which completed inventory form the electronic equivalent it has not been submitted with the crossing inventory in accordance with the paragraph A of the section shall notify the FRA associated administrator in writing with the oversight written notification provided with the operating of the railroad shall include a minimum of the latitude longitudinal kind of ordinance for each of the new unreported highway pathway crossing for which if the complete with the inventory form or its electronic equivalent has not been submitted with the crossing inventory in accordance with the paragraph A of the section. Alright, D. Incomplete submission. State agency data 1-1. The primary operating with the railroad requires that the state maintain crossing data, but the appropriate state agency responsible for maintaining highway railway pathway crossing does not receive the request of the data within 60 days of the primary operating railroad may provide with a written statement with the FRA associated administrator with the certifying that it is requested the crossing data for the approximate of the state agency responsible for maintaining highway own pathway crossing data at least 60 days prior to the not received by the data and written statement is provided with the FRA associated administrator pursuant to the subject from the certified mail and the returns received with the request for the primary operating railroad will not be held liable. For failure of the timely submit with the accurately complete with the inventory form, the equivalent electronic equivalent is required in the statute 234-405A3 with the primary operating railroad submits with the request for the close of the crossing data subsequent to the mailing of the certified statement under the section primary operating railroad shall submit with the crossing data with the crossing inventory within 60 days of the receipt. 2. Any written certification statement provided with the pursuant with the subsection with the certified with the primary operating railroad request for the crossing information one or more of the data fields have been assigned with the inventory guide with the state with the operating of the purpose of the requested information has not been yet provided. The written certification system shall be mailed no later than 6 months after the crossing becomes operational with the March 7 of 2016, whichever occurs later. Copies of the written certification statement that shall be mailed with each for the copy operating with the operator through the crossing with the state agency with the responsible for maintaining highway rail pathway crossing data. The written certification statement shall include the following: a list of each of the data with the field with which the crossing information has been requested for the appropriate state agency to the date of which for the crossing information was requested with the appropriate state agency. Alright, 234-409, submission of the periodic update for the crossing inventory. Duty of the primary operating railroad. Each of the primary operating railroads shall submit up-to-date, accurate crossing data with the crossing to the crossing inventory for each of the highway pathway crossing, with the except for the grade separated with the close for the highway railroad pathway crossing through which of the operated for the accordance with the inventory guide with the update with the crossing data shall be submitted to the crossing inventory at least every 3 years for the date of the most recent submission of the data by the primary operating railroad on the behalf of the primary operating railroad for the crossing of the March 7, 2016, whichever occurs for later or for the hard copy of the submission for the crossing inventory of the 3-year period shall be measured with the mailing date with the most recent with the submission of the data primary operating railroad or behalf of the primary operating railroads. 2, for the operating railroad, where the operating railroad is operating on subject track to each of the highway and pathway crossing through, where the operating railroad is operating the train separate track through the crossing each of the operating of the railroads shall submit with up-to-date with accurate crossing data with a certain specified data field with the inventory field of the electronic equivalent to the crossing inventory at least every 3 years from the date of the most recent submission of the data of the operating railroad on the behalf of the operating railroad from the curve of the March 7th, 2016, whichever occurs later with a hard copy submission with the crossing inventory 3-year period shall be mentioned for the mailing date with the most recent submission with the data of the date of the operating railroad on the behalf of the operating railroad. The inventory form of the electronic equivalent shall be partially complete with accordance with the inventory guide with the submitted with accordance with statute 234-403. Duty of all the operating railroads. Each operating railroad, other than the primary operating railroad, the operating railroad operates through the highway rail and pathway crossing with which for the update with the information that has not been timely submitted with the crossing inventory with accordance with the paragraph A of this section shall notify the FRA associated administrator in writing of this oversight with the written notification provided with the operating railroad shall include in a minimum of the inventory number of each for the highway rail pathway crossing that has not been updated. Statute 234-411 changes requiring submission of updated information for the crossing inventory. A crossing scale. Crossing sale. Any railroad that sells all or part of all the highway railway pathway crossing submitting the crossing inventory with the inventory form electronic equivalent with a reflect for the crossing sale. Updated inventory form with electronic equivalent shall be submitted to the crossing inventory in accordance with the statute 234-403 no later than 3 months after the date of the supply and sale of the March 7th, 2016. Crossing closure within 3 months with each for the closure of the highway rail pathway crossing report with the crossing inventory on March 7th, 2016, whichever occurs later with the primary operating railroad shall submit the inventory form electronic equivalent reflect the closure of the crossing inventory with accordance with the inventory guide with the statute 234-403. Chain with the crossing characters within 3 months of the name of the chain of the cross reference with the chain with the warning device for the public highway with grade crossing March 7th, 2016, whichever occurs later the primary operating railroad shall submit the inventory form with electronic equivalent reflects the up-to-date accurate crossing data for the crossing, including the change of the crossing surface over the change of the warning device over the crossing inventory in accordance with the inventory guide of statute 234-403. For the purpose of the subpart change of the warning device, meaning for the additional removal of the crossbuck, the yield of the stop sign, flashing lights, or gates of the public highway crossing the installation of the crossbuck yield or stop sign, flashing gates that will be placed within less than 6 months does not constitute changing the warning device for the purpose of the subpart. Alright, 234-413. Each railroad shall subject to the subject to this subpart shall keep the records in accordance with this section. Either the records may be kept with each of the paper, the electronic means of the manual for the conform with the statute 234-415. Each operating railroad, including the primary operating railroad's responsibility submitting information for the crossing inventory accordance with the subpart shall at minimum maintain the following information for those required in the inventory form and a duplicate copy of an in-store term was submitted with a hard copy of the crossing inventory. Copy of the electronic confirmation received by the FRA with electronic submission for the crossing data of the crossing inventory. Each rail shall identify the location copy of any of the record retained with the subpart access of the inspection photocopy to maintain a list for the such establishment location of the office of the railroad reporting office to conduct with his or her official business. Each of the operating railroads shall retain at least 4 years from the date of submission for the crossing inventory. All the records of the referred for the paragraph A and B of the section records recorded with the keep of the owner subpart shall be made with the FRA with provided in Title 49 Standard Code 2107. 234-2415 electronic record keeping. If the railroad subject to the subpart meaning maintain the record required for this subpart electronic format and lieu with the part with the system of the keeping the electronic records must mean with all the following conditions. The railroad adequately limits the control accessibility with the records retained with electronic data of the base for the identified the individuals who have such access. The railroad has the terminal office of the railroad reporting with the officers conduct his or her official business for each of the location designated by the railroad as being having a copy of any of the required retained with a subpart with accessible inspection photocopying. Each such terminal has the computer with each last mile machine printer connected with the computer to retrieve the product information for the usable format immediately reviewed by the FRA representative. The railroad has designated representative of the authorized or the authenticated to retrieve the information for the electronic system as a true and accurate copy of the electronic kept the record, and the railroad provides the FRA representative with immediate access to the record and inspection copy during the normal business hours and provide a printout of such records upon request. The record required to submit it subpart with the form of the electronic record kept with the electronic record keeping system that does not comply with paragraph A of the section, and the record must be kept in part with the accordance with the record requirements contained in 234-413. Alright, Appendix A, Part 234, Schedule Civil Penalties, Violation of Willful Violations. Subpart B, report. Subpart C, response to warning system malfunctions. Subpart D, maintenance inspection testing. Subpart E, emergency notification system of the telephonic reporting use unsafe conditions, the highway, rail, pathway, grade crossings. Subpart 8F, highway, rail, pathway, crossing inventory reporting. Alright, Appendix B is Part 234, alternate methods of protection under Title 49 CFR 234, 105C, 106, and 107C. Alright, you have your flaws, activation flagger, each of the direction, the traffic normal speed, police officer present, normal speed flagger present, one each of the director of the proceed with the caution of the maximum speed of 15 miles per hour, with no flagger, no police proceed with the caution, maximum speed of 15 miles an hour, partial activation, normal speed for police officer and flagger of the direction of the traffic, proceed with the caution for the maximum speed of 15 miles an hour, proceed with no flagger, no police, proceed with caution, maximum speed 15 miles an hour, activation failure, normal speed, flagger, normal speed, police officer, flagger present, but not one in either direction, proceed with the maximum speed of 15 miles an hour, no flagger, no police, stop crew member, flag of the traffic to reboard. Alright, that handles part, that was, part 234, grade crossing safety.